A couple weeks ago, I was at a regional championship qualifier, and I witnessed a bad judge call. It involved Strict Proctor being on the battlefield and an opponent playing Fable the Mirror Breaker. The players innocently called the judge, essentially asking if Strict Proctor affects Fable the Mirror Breaker at all, and the judge ruled that Fable the Mirror Breaker does not make a goblin token, but they get to keep Fable the Mirror Breaker. And that is very wrong. And so rather than hyper-criticizing this judge call, bad judge calls happen all the time. Judges are doing their best with the information that they have. And I think as long as we have learning experiences alongside those judge calls, then it can have a positive outcome. Luckily, just so people watching, this did not affect the game in the least. I talked to the player afterward who actually watches this channel, if you're watching, hi, informing them that it was a bad call, and they said it wasn't a big deal. They just paid the 2 mana, and they weren't going to use that mana anyway. So that's good, it didn't affect the match. But I wanted to make a video sort of talking about what Strict Proctor actually does. Let's talk about this card. It is a 2-mana 1/3 with flying, Spirit Cleric, that says, whenever a permanent entering the battlefield causes a triggered ability to trigger, counter that ability unless its controller pays 2. Now, the primary way that Strict Proctor is used in Pioneer is within the context of a blue-white control deck. They play Strict Proctor, and then they play Lotus Field, trigger Strict Proctor, choose not to pay, Lotus Field triggered ability resolves, so they get a land that just produces 3 mana. Very powerful. One thing to understand about Strict Proctor is it only affects triggered abilities. So triggered abilities that are caused when a permanent enters the battlefield. Lotus Field, specifically, says when Lotus Field enters the battlefield, sacrifice 2 lands. That word when signifies a triggered ability, which means it triggers Strict Proctor. In fact, there are very specific words that Wizards of the Coast uses to signify a triggered ability. Those words are when, whenever, or at. That signifies a triggered effect. Things that do not affect Strict Proctor are things like Sagas. How Sagas work is as they enter the battlefield, they get a counter on them. There's no trigger that happens at all. When that counter goes on them, then a triggered ability happens where the thing written on the card happens. So for example, a Fable the Mirror Breaker, as it enters the battlefield, it has a lore counter, and the act of getting a lore counter gives them the goblin. There's no triggered ability that is caused by it entering the battlefield, so Strict Proctor does not affect it at all, and that's true for all Sagas. Further, cards like Dauntless Bodyguard says, as it enters the battlefield, choose a creature. There's no trigger that enters the stack at all. So Strict Proctor does not affect Dauntless Bodyguard. As it enters, you pick something. There's nothing on Dauntless Bodyguard that says when, whenever, or at, which means it is not a triggered ability. And that's a different way to think about what triggered abilities are. Triggered abilities use the stack where non-triggered abilities don't. A lore counter going on Fable the Mirror Breaker does not use the stack. However, getting the goblin uses the stack, but that is not triggered by it entering the battlefield. It's triggered by the lore counter going. I'm sure there are more examples, but I feel like I'm sure there are more examples, but there's no reason for me to drone on. I feel like I've explained this topic sufficiently. And hopefully you can use this information for your home games, understanding the rules at your FNMs, and to help judges out, or if you're a judge yourself. If you have any questions, please leave them in the comments. And if you like this video, please be sure to like and subscribe. Check me out on social media. Links are above me and in the description. Thank you so much for watching. I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.